Now, I have the pleasure of introducing and welcoming to the stage our keynote speakers for today, Dr. Chris Benner and Dr. Manuel Pastor, to introduce their project, Solidarity Economics, a collaboration between the Institute for Social Transformation, the Everett Program at UC Santa Cruz, and USC's Dornsife Equity Research Institute.
Thanks. We prefer to stand in front of you, sort of a lounge singer approach. So I'm Manuel Pastor. I've recently been, in the past, introducing myself as from the scandal-plagued University of Southern California, but now apparently just from the scandal-plagued city of Los Angeles. So, damn, we've had quite a week. We've been going through a lot about it. Great to be with you. Some of you may know that I used to actually be a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I was actually an undergraduate there, the Fighting Banana Slugs. Very exciting. The thing that I found interesting shuttling in my life between LA and Santa Cruz is when you get directions to come to a conference like this and someone says, you're supposed to dress business casual. And you know, in LA, that means a skinnier tie. In Santa Cruz, that means you actually have clothes on when you... So let me get started with... Hi, Chris. So let me just get started with this presentation. I always like to let folks know before I do that while I'm speaking, if my voice tires out or sounds a little harsh, it's not that I've been screaming at the news, although I have been, is that I have a voice condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. Diane Rehm, who used to be on NPR, had it too. And so it can cause your voice to break or tire out. And actually, this is true. It gets treated once a month with Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles. It's very much works for us. So it's wonderful to be together in person, but it's important to also realize the time that we've been through when we've been apart. And of course, some of it has been the loneliness of Zoom. But another part of it is that COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. The racial wealth gap, which meant that some people had no cushion in an economic emergency, the lack of equitable access to health care, the way in which in the first CARES package that came out, mixed status families were eliminated, which by the way is about 14% of the state of California. And the way in which some people were put desperately at risk. So this disease revealed our illnesses, and I think causes us to have an examination of those inequities that emerged in terms of the disease and eventually in terms of vaccination as well. It was at the same time a crisis that revealed our mutuality, that is people coming to each other's aid, but also our divisions, the kind of pointless fights around masks and public health that took place. And it all had a backdrop of a racial reckoning in the United States in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the deep-seated recognition not only of anti-Black policing, but the fact that racist policing was just the tip of a racist iceberg of inequalities in terms of educational opportunity, in terms of place in the labor market, in terms of questions even of environmental exposure. And so what we've been arguing is there's no going back to a normal that did not work beforehand for so many. And if we are to think about what we need to do in this moment, We need to have not a recovery, but a reimagination, to not traipse back to those baked in inequalities, but instead to think about what we can do differently going forward. So, so what do we think needs to be done? This could actually be the subject of a 12-hour lecture, but these two professors won't do that. Going to talk about three things. The middle one, the most important, the need to center tackling racial equity, the need to craft a new economic story that talks about how we're all tied together, and then a full recognition that in order to get there, we're going to have a very different kind of politics that combines agitation and collaboration, that lifts up difficult issues of equity and forces them to the table. Because equity never arrives unless it comes kicking and screaming and protesting. And at the same time, we need collaboration to be able to address these issues and find what we need to do on the economy. So on the racial equity piece, very obvious in terms of the need to have these deep conversations. And one of the reasons to see why it's so important, particularly when you're talking about the economy, is the following chart. This shows you household income, Los Angeles County, for the 2014 to 2018 period. And you can see here what a lot of people talk about, which is the gaps in household income. So $83,000 median household income for whites, about $45,000 and $52,000 for Black and Latino households, about $74,000 for Asian Americans. So we would all acknowledge that those are pretty big gaps that we would, many of us at least, like to address. Now, here's what's interesting. Let's use the same graph, same axis, but instead look at families raising children, that is, households with children under the age of 5. Watch what happens to those disparities. I like it when you made that noise, so I'll do that again. So you can see that those disparities are actually much higher. And by the way, this holds for the state of California as well. So for a white family, about $124,000 median household income. For Black and Latino families, in the 50s. And what you can see is that we are essentially baking inequality in to the next generation, an issue I'll come to at the end. So what do we need to do? Fortunately, there's a new book that tells you exactly what you should do. And that book is called Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. It's got two great, handsome co-authors who have bridged many different divides, including the divide between Northern California and Southern California. You know there's tension there. I know it because my wife is from Northern California. She views it as a major act of charity for having married me. She's probably right. But so one of the great things about a book is the first day that it arrives, and it's got sort of a new book smell to it, and then you look at the cover and you're really, really excited. And the frustrating thing about when a new book arrives is you realize that you could have said the whole thing in 3 sentences. So let me save you a little time. Here are the 3 major sentences of the book, and then Chris is going to talk about how that plays out in the Monterey Bay. First sentence, and if you take nothing else away from today, please take away this and maybe the second piece as well. We need to stop talking about the economy and start talking about our economy. When you talk about the economy, it makes it sound like a set of rules given by God or nature or the market that are out there, instead of a set of property arrangements and power relationships and rules that we ourselves make. And that narrative change is so important because when we say our economy, we put ourselves, all of us, in it. Think about the following thing. When you hear economists say raising the minimum wage is bad for the economy, by the way, for which there's very little evidence. But you can hear them saying it's bad for the economy. It's not bad for our economy, because our economy includes minimum wage workers whose wages will go up and will have more time for their families to invest in their kids' education. Second thing, and I think this is important for both our business colleagues in the room and super important for those of you in the nonprofit, equity-oriented sort of spaces, is that we need to stop talking about equity as though it's a special interest, as though it's just about fairness and inclusion and justice. Now, do I think fairness and inclusion and justice are good things? Sure. But when you over-incarcerate, you're throwing away talent. When you don't have an immigration system that allows people to legalize their status, you're preventing them from being able to start businesses, be entrepreneurs. When you have an educational system that's under-delivering for kids of color and low-income kids, you're shortchanging the productivity and prosperity of the future. We need to be thinking about equity, not just as an issue of fairness and inclusion, but also as one of our key planks to be able to get to prosperity and productivity. Not everything we do for equity will produce prosperity, but a whole lot of things will that we often leave lying on the table that actually could be good for just about all of us. But that, I think, is the third lesson. Even though equity is probably good for most of us in our economy, the way that we're going to get there is by having social movements that can change the underlying balance of power, because some people do benefit from the current set of arrangements. And movements, too, that can force a dialogue that actually brings people together to do something about the economy. And now, Dr. Chris Benner.
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be with you. And you will have a chance to hear a few more of Manuel's jokes at the end of this presentation. And I should say, it is such a pleasure to be in person. This is actually the first time since the pandemic that Manuel and I have had a chance to present together in person. Oh, I forgot not so much about the lounge singer, but the stand-up comedian routine that he has, which is great. And I will say, we have gotten together many times, safely tested during the pandemic, part of it which was to write this book, which we wrote in a couple of very intensive writing sessions where we'd spend our time in shorts and t-shirts talking about regression equations and margins of error and t-scores, because for data nerds, that's what counts as having a good time. But what I want to do today is say a little bit about what does a solidarity economics framework help us see better in the Monterey Bay region. And I want to start with looking at some of those dimensions of equity and inequality and emphasizing race and place as part of that. And the key thing, as Manuel so articulately says, is that inequality is undermining our economic well-being. And you can see that a little bit in the macro figures. This just shows the net total job change in the Monterey Bay region from roughly 3 years ago, August of 2019. It's a better metric to start than the start of the pandemic because of the cyclical nature of employment in the agricultural industries. And whereas the state of California and the nation as a whole has recovered net total jobs lost during the pandemic, we're still behind. And we're particularly behind in leisure and hospitality and some of the other service sectors, including high-skilled financial services, business and professional services. And lots of our communities are still suffering from the legacy of that pandemic. And the clicker will hopefully work. So one thing I want to emphasize from some of those regression equations, as we looked at metropolitan regions and urban places across the country, those bars show the ways in which income inequality is really the largest predictor of a region's likelihood to fall into recession during an economic downturn. But other major factors include racial segregation, as well as the fragmentation of local government in regional economies, and what that means for challenges to collaboration, and challenges to sharing resources within what's an effective economic unit with labor market travel and commute patterns as well. And if we look at that in the context of the Monterey Bay region, we often think about Santa Cruz County and Monterey County and San Benito County as distinct political units. But as we think about our economy in the region, it's useful to divide it between sort of the inland area, Pajaro Valley, Salinas Valley, where agriculture is really a dominant force, and where economic opportunity is much more constrained, and the coastal counties, Santa Cruz, Monterey, which have very different demographics and a very different economy, though it is deeply integrated, as we'll see in a minute. This chart here is a regional opportunity index that developed when I was at UC Davis, which is just a cumulative index of opportunity around a variety of indicators of education, economy, housing, transportation, and environmental issues as well. And it just shows in red the areas that are most challenged, in green those that are doing much better. But if you look at that distinction, most of the population in our region is in those inland areas, and a very different demographic. In that inland areas, 65% are Latino or Hispanic, only 27% non-Hispanic white. Whereas in the coastal parts, both in Monterey and Santa Cruz, 62 to 69% are non-Hispanic white, very large racial differences. We have a very large foreign-born population in this region. Talent comes here, and I mean that talent working in the fields and the tremendous skill and determination and work that goes into that, or whether it's talent in our high-tech industries or educational institutions. But again, much larger in the inland areas. And of course, many people are undocumented and are important contributing members of our economy, our society, our school systems, our families, and we need to be taking that into account in the region. And of course, income, as we know, varies tremendously between those coastal areas, much more wealthy with higher income, and our inland areas, much higher levels of poverty, low income, and poverty. And this is a measure of a reasonable earning level of 200% of the federal poverty level. Over 30% of families, households in that inner area of Pajaro Valley and the Salinas Valley really struggling still. Demographics are really important, and understanding the age difference in both place and race in our region is really important to understand. This just shows the median age in that inland part of our region at 34, whereas in Santa Cruz and Monterey, over 40. It's most striking when you look at it by race across the region. The median age for our Latino population is 28. For our non-Hispanic white population is 49. That's 21-year difference. Now, why is that important? This is our current and future workforce, the younger population, which are predominantly people of color. This is our increasingly retired population, right, who are living here in the amenities in the area, but depend tremendously on the workforce for the accommodation restaurant industry, for a lot of the care work, for shoring up Social Security, that the wages in that is really what's important for supporting that. And so when we have these levels of differences and inequality in income, it undermines all of our economic well-being. We often talk about this racial wealth gap, which is the difference between the portion of non-Hispanic white in the over 65 population, which in this region is 70%, and the under 18 population, the future workforce, which is only 26% non-Hispanic white or 74% people of color. And again, this is the population that's our future. And if we're going to be thinking about the long-term economic well-being of this region, how do we help ensure maximum opportunity for people growing up in this region? I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the spatial inequality in this region and the fragmented local government system that we have and the challenges that creates. Part of that has to do with the amount of revenue in our local governments for providing key city services. And this shows the per capita revenue of some of the cities in the inland area. Salinas of just over $1,000 per person Gonzales, 1,800, Watsonville, 2,600, compared to Monterey and Carmel by the Sea of over $5,000 per person in per capita revenue. And when you plot that across all incorporated cities in the county, on the x-axis, the more revenue per capita on the right, on the y-axis, the higher percentage people of color, you can see clearly the racial dimensions of inequality that go along with that place inequality as well. Now, some people may be thinking, well, part of that has to do with property values, and property tax is a really key part of that, and so that's part of what's driving it. But when we look at the labor market, we start to see our mutuality and integration. Here, the y-axis shows the percentage of the workforce that is non-resident in the city. And it shows in every city in the region, the majority of workers don't live in the city. And yet they're contributing dramatically to the economic livelihood of the city, from which sales tax and the transient occupancy tax, the hotel tax, really drives a lot of the revenue generation, particularly in Monterey, Carmel, Santa Cruz, some of our tourist destinations. And because we don't have a system for revenue sharing across the different cities, this reinforces some of that racial inequality. And I just want to share a quick story. I did quite a bit of work in South Africa during the period leading up to the first democratic elections in 1994. One of the features of apartheid in South Africa was legally segregated cities in which the black townships had very little economy, and yet the black workers were really driving the economy of the white cities. And in the 1980s, in the social movements that contributed to that first democratic election, one of the mass rallying cries, and this is true, you could have 100,000 people in a stadium yelling this, one city, one tax base. Now, that's not quite as inspiring as equality, liberty, democracy. And yet, as someone who's trained in city and regional planning and regional economics, it really spoke to my heart that a mass movement could understand the power of taxation, the power of land use, and the power of local government in shaping economic opportunity. And one of the first things that the first democratically elected government in South Africa did is restructure local governments to make a single regional government covering all the metropolitan urban areas, each one, to contribute to that inequality. And one of the things we discovered, by the way, in our regression equations is that cities in the US that have a larger land area, and places like Jacksonville, Florida, where they have merged the city and the county, so now the county is the functional local government unit, they have a much better record in equity and economic well-being. So I don't know if one city, one tax base will ever catch on in California, but I hope we can all better understand the importance of collaborating and revenue sharing across those local governments and across the region. So that's some of the challenging news, but I really want to focus on the second key point, which is about how mutuality and movements are already helping our economy, and we're seeing important movements in that in recent years, in part sparked by the challenges we've seen in the pandemic. And this is just a reminder of how concentrated the impact of COVID has been and still is in our region. This is just simply number of cases within the Tri-County area by race, and Hispanic Latino population much higher than non-Hispanic white and other communities, and higher on a proportional rate as well. And that is correlated with or connected to a very high diversity or difference in hospitalization rates and death rates. And these are age-adjusted death rates across California, because we don't have it for the local area, that again shows in the early parts of the pandemic, the death rate for the Hispanic Latino population was over 3 times as high as that for the non-Hispanic white population. So tremendous impact. And of course, there's many reasons for that. Part of it is more essential workers, working in the fields, working in crowding housing situations, low-income workers in restaurant or the grocery industry. But the good news about it is part of the way this region's responded. And there are similar stories in Santa Cruz County, but I want to tell this story in Monterey County. And there are people in this room who know this story better than me, so I apologize if I don't get it all right. But the way it was told to me is in that fall of 2020, and you all remember we had the color-coded scheme for counties in California of purple, red, orange, yellow, and you had to, move up over time based on your overall COVID incidence rate in the county. But one thing the state did is put in place an equity provision that said you also had to look at what are the COVID rates in your most vulnerable census tracts in your county. And that was going to be a key factor in determining whether a county could move up in those categories. And the county was really trying to get out PPE to people, personal protective equipment, and educating about how to be safe, about not going to work or collaborating and coming together when people are feeling sick. And the business community on the Monterey Peninsula, of course, was really anxious to get the economy, our economy, see how hard it is to remember to do that sometimes, to get our economy opening up again. But to do that required addressing COVID in many of these farm worker communities, low-income communities in the Salinas Valley, where there's a lot of distrust of government officials because of how many of people are undocumented, and where it's also very difficult for people not to go to work because of their economic circumstances. And COPA, Communities Organized for Relational Power in Action, and that's a very deliberate wording, has been organizing in this region for over 20 years and knew firsthand many of the conditions and challenges in those communities, and was able to bring that experience together with some of the business leaders in the Monterey Peninsula to the county and get funded at a $5 million grant, close to $5 million, this VITA program. I forget the acronym, vaccinations, someone can help me, but it's all about health education and health support work in the pandemic, with funding by the Community Foundation of Monterey County, Together Toward Health, investing in a community health worker program, working very closely with these community-based organizations who've been working in these communities for decades, in most cases, and have deep trust and knowledge and connection. And that linkage between the county, business leaders, community organizations organizing along with the state mandate has created an award-winning and super powerful community health worker program that we hope can be a model for greater funding for our public health system going forward. I also want to lift up a measure that's on the Monterey County ballot this November, Measure Q, which would raise revenue from landowners to invest in early childhood education. And some of you may have heard Nobel Prize winning laureate economist James Heckman, who was here last Friday, talking about his research and others in the ways that investing in childcare and early childhood education has tremendous economic benefits in a variety of different ways. What's most impressive to me is the way this incredibly broad coalition has come together. Everything from the Service Employees Union to MBEP's an important player, community organizations, the Monterey County Hospitality Association, chambers of commerce in the area. And I particularly pull out the recommendation from the Monterey Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, where they say that your chamber recognizes that many member business and organizations have struggled to find workers. We have not been able to grow that hospitality industry, in part because people have not been able to come to work. They have children they need to take care of, they're concerned about health. And one reason often cited for why workers aren't returning is the lack of accessible and affordable childcare. So business leaders in this region are recognizing childcare is an economic investment in the moment. It's also an investment in the future productivity and educational attainment of children. And there are very strong research studies and evidence showing that investing in early childhood education pays off at, according to James Heckman's calculations, at a 13% annual rate in total economic output. But you can also hear it in the stories that I've heard some of the people in our communities tell of how different it is when your child care for your kids is having them sit in your car as you're working in the field versus being able to have a trusted and well-paid, highly qualified child care and early childhood protector taking care of them, and the outcomes that that creates. It's huge. And this is an example where people are coming together to make that investment. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about that is, again, thinking who's going to benefit from it. And the most immediate beneficiaries are those families with kids. And we have, again, in that age difference, tremendously different patterns of who has kids who would benefit directly from that additional funding and who already has some level of enrollment in early childhood education, which is, again, much higher in the predominantly white communities on the coast, much lower in the inland areas. And our business leaders understand the importance of investing in early childhood education. The challenge is really going to be, to what extent will voters, many of the homeowners and those on the peninsulas, will see their own economic future in children of people that don't look like them, young, brown children in the fields, and will they see that as their important part of our economy? And it will be a challenge, because if you look at voting rates by age, the elderly population votes at much higher rates than younger population. This is specific to Monterey County. And when you look by race, again, non-Latino, non-Asian populations vote at a much higher rate. So I would encourage all of you to go out and talk to people. If you believe and agree in an investment in early childhood education, how do we help build those bridges across the racial divide and the place divide to invest in our economy going forward? I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and we've come a long way already on that initiative. And just a shout out to all the people who've been involved in putting that proposal together. Look, there are other examples I could give you, and Chancellor LaRive mentioned this Salinas Inclusive Economic Development Initiative that I've had the honor to be part of, funded by the Irvine Foundation with support from the Community Foundation as well, bringing a diverse set of community organizations together, everything from the Central Labor Council to workforce development agencies, community organizing groups, to an arts education program in the Alisal School District, to come together and see how their work is important and contributes to, and how they can gain greater power in affecting economic decision-making in the region. Regions Rise Together, a broad coalition of community groups coming together with the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership to really try and set out a long-term economic vision that invests in human capital, that invests in economic development and growing industries that pay good jobs, and invests in our neighborhoods, and targeting those areas that have been left behind and kept behind. And then one of the more exciting things is the work that the Uplift Central Coast Coalition has done in the last really 12 months. And Tara Goria has been a really key leader in that process around a broader coastal region of 6 counties from Santa Cruz down to Ventura. And one of the key things is applying for funding from the state, which is up to a $600 million funding source to recover from the pandemic, that explicitly says we aspire to disrupt business as usual processes. This is the opportunity that's coming again from the state to rethink how we do economic development. And the Uplift Coalition, Central Coast Coalition, has pulled together a collaborative that includes a tremendous diversity of organizations that you can read and see there. This is early days for this collaboration. And I know there's a lot of people coming into it from a community background, from that experience of lack of trust, lack of respect, lack of involvement in our economy, and are excited looking forward, but are cautious. Like, is this going to turn into what we hope it can all be? And that's where I want to lift up one of the things that came out of some of our previous work together and the previous book, which, by the way, is also free to download online. That's part of our solidarity with our readers, is to make it free to you. So you can go to solidarityeconomics.org is the website to download that. But this book, Equity, Growth, and Community, was looking at these dynamics around the country and metropolitan regions that brought together diverse collaborations. And it's not that people were coming together with shared values from the beginning. In fact, it's just the opposite. If you remember the movie Casablanca, at the end, Captain Renault says, "Round up the usual suspects." Well, this is just the opposite. These are cases where it's the unusual suspects who are coming together to plan for and develop long-term economic growth in a region. And it's important in that, we often think in America like, show me, and it's what's more important is not what you say, it's what you do. But part of what we argue is that if we're going to be able to move together, we have to be building relationships face to face and race to race and place to place in which we recognize that, talk is not cheap. In fact, talk requires effort, but it can help change hearts and minds in ways that encourages collaboration rather than some sense of zero-sum growth. And so with that, I want to turn it back to Manuel to sort of close it out in our last minutes about some steps going forward.
Thanks. So what I want to kind of close out with is talk a little bit about the whole question of data collection and accountability. And one of the things that I think that happens often is when people hear about the centrality of addressing equity as part of an economic agenda, they often say, gosh, that's really important, but do we really have sufficient data to be looking at these disparities? I think the last 40 or 50 slides that Chris presented should convince you that that data exists and that there's no excuse for not tracking it. But
I did actually cut out 40 or 50 slides that Manuel recommended.
I know, you should have seen the first thing. I was like, damn, Chris, these people will have no patience for us. So the thing I really want to point out is that there are some websites. This kind of in-depth work that Chris is doing is really important, but we at my shop are the back end of a website called the National Equity Atlas, which has disaggregated data by race, nativity, gender, education level, et cetera, for the top 150 metropolitan areas in the United States, the 100 largest cities, all 50 states plus DC, and all of that nested in an argument about why addressing these issues of inequality will actually be good for prosperity. Because we think that data should be a base for dialogue, and it should also be a moment for the forging of a sense of common destiny, so that we use the data not to point out differences as a way of dividing, but using the data to find a way to get to uncommon common ground. We also have the Bay Area Equity Atlas, and one that I think will make a big difference to at least some of you, something called the California Immigrant Data Portal, which actually also includes estimates on the undocumented population, mixed status families, and I think has been really crucial to getting people to understand some key facts, which I think are particularly salient here in this region. We often talk about undocumented immigrants. I don't know whether you know this, but for people without papers in California, more than 2/3 have been in the country for longer than 10 years. And the number of undocumented people is actually more than matched by the citizen and green card holder family members who live with them. They're not undocumented immigrants. They're undocumented Californians. They are essential to our economy. They are part of our community. They're part of the social fabric of a community like this. Now, before I get to that, one thing I did want to mention, I'm glad you told the story of the COVID equity metric, and I just want to take a little bit of credit for that. I was on the Governor's Task Force on Jobs and Business Recovery, and as soon as it began, I said, this is just going to rip its way through the immigrant community, through communities of color, because while it was starting COVID amongst the more affluent and people who had been able to travel or be in connection with international travelers, it was clear it was going to go to the most vulnerable communities. And I still remember throwing a fit at a meeting, virtual meeting, of 100 state leaders about what the fuck about what I was saying did you not pay attention to? And quite quickly, the public health department came up with this metric. And it's a very interesting thing. The metric was that you could reopen faster if you're more distressed. The COVID rates, testing positivity testing in the more distressed areas, if those rates were similar to what you were getting countywide. So you could still have more actual disparities, but you were actually at least delivering sufficient testing to be able to catch it in these communities. So metrics can play an extraordinarily important role in terms of accountability. Now, the one last thing I want to mention, and then just a few closing points, is why, in some ways, this is so important. One of the things you're going to notice here, this is what demographers love. It's called an age pyramid. It's from 1950. And what it shows you is that in 1950, the United States looked like a lot of demographers say we should think about our demography, which is that lots of young people, that bottom group, and then as you move up in age, you can see that the number of people begins to get smaller because, of course, as we age and age, we get closer to passing to a different phase. I've been thinking a little bit about this. I just turned 66. I am arguing that it's the new 65, so tremendous vibrancy. So this is what we look like in 1950. Let me show you what our age pyramid looks like in 2060. We're going to have a lot less young people. We will be getting older as a result of improved medical care. And although some in the United States are worried about how many immigrants are coming, people who are demographers and economists are worried that we're not getting enough immigrants to fill in the middle of the labor market. Because they come in with whatever level of education they've got, they come in ready to work. And that fills in the middle of the labor market. And the central message of this is simple. How many of you have children? Great. How many of you hope your children do better than you, or at least as well? Okay, how many of you hope your children do less well? Maybe to teach them a lesson about something, so what this chart is telling us is that the dependency ratio, the ratio of working age adults to those who are retired and those who are young, is going to increase in the United States by about 50% over the next 40 years. So you better hope that your children and everyone else's children do 50% better than you. And if it is not the case that we begin to think about all of our children, that if we close that racial generation gap that Chris was talking about, we're not going to make the investments we all need. So what do we want to leave you with in terms of messages? That clearly the need to center racial and economic equity, the idea that equity must be at the forefront and not an afterthought. When you hear someone discussing an economic strategy and they say we're going to grow that sector and then we'll worry about what happens in terms of distribution later, that's a conversation you should disrupt and say we need to figure out how we make sure that equity is thought about from the beginning. Second, we need to make sure that when we're talking about equity and in particular data, that we are bringing community members in to say what data is important to you, what accountability measures are important to you as well. And then the final thing I want to leave you with is that something I said at the beginning is to sort of expect challenges along the way. I am so proud that Chris Benner subtly suggested that apartheid is not a bad description for what's going on in this region. In terms of the different lives that people lead, I'd noticed that, Chris. That shit was really subtle. You know, in terms of the lives that people live, the very different economies that are there. And we need to expect that these conversations about equity will be uncomfortable. If they are completely comfortable, we're not having a real and honest and forthright conversation. And when we start to think about collaboration, I know it's a word that many people use. I know that, how many of you are involved in collaborations? How many of you are involved in easy, really gentle, no conflict collaborations? So often when people talk about collaboration, they are talking about something like that ride in Disneyland, It's a Small World After All, where there's little children singing and everyone loves one another. And you know that collaborations are actually not like that. And what collaborations are really is principled conflict. It's about bringing together people, because if you are bringing together people you totally agree with, you're just hanging out with your friends. Collaboration is about bringing together people with whom you have conflicts, but you agree on certain principles, and you also agree on principles about how you conflict. That you will argue with one another, that you will lift up interests, but that you will respect one another, you will talk about each other's interests even when they're not there, and you will find a way to come back to one another to be able to make a better region and a better California. Thank you.